What if the most powerful man in France believed he would shatter like a wine glass if you so much as brushed his sleeve? Imagine a kingdom ruled by a man terrified of touch, convinced his body was made of glass. This isn't a metaphor. This is the true story of Charles VI, the king who turned a realm into a madhouse because he lost his mind. And trust me, you haven't heard madness until you've seen what padded jackets, iron rods, and royal delusions did to a country at war. If you're drawn to the hidden horrors of history, subscribe now, because this story only gets darker. They called him Charles the Beloved, a boy king, clever, curious, full of promise. France, still bleeding from the 100 Years' War, was desperate for stability, and young Charles seemed like a gift from heaven. By 20, he had seized real power, cast off his corrupt uncles, and for a moment it felt like light was returning to the kingdom. But light is fragile. And Charles would soon believe he was too. Behind the palace walls, whispers traveled faster than sermons. The king forgets who he is. The king sees enemies in shadows. It began, like many tragedies, with a forest, a summer heat wave, and a single accidental clang of metal. A page dropped his lance. It struck a helmet. That innocent sound cracked something invisible in Charles' mind. And what poured out would haunt France for decades. Charles turned on his own knight's sword, raised eyes wild. He screamed of traitors and betrayal, slashing at men who had bled for him. His own brother barely escaped the blade. For 4 hours, the King of France did not know his name, did not recognize his court, did not even know he was king. When the fog lifted, he asked why everyone looked so frightened. He remembered nothing. What began as a terrifying episode became a pattern. The attacks returned, sudden, violent, senseless. Sometimes he believed he was being hunted, sometimes he couldn't speak. But the worst was yet to come. In one episode, Charles suddenly refused to move. Servants begged, pleaded. He simply whispered, "I'll break." And then, as if explaining the most logical fact in the world, he declared, "I am made of glass." Glass, not as metaphor, not as poetry, literal glass. He believed his body bones, skin, even his heart, was brittle crystal. That if someone touched him, he would explode into shards. Courtiers adapted in horror. They walked on tiptoe. Door frames were widened. Cushions were added to chairs. The king wore padded robes, iron rods sewn into his sleeves like armor. France's monarch had become a walking ornament, shimmering, terrified, and cracked. But Charles's fragility was not just physical. As he withdrew into his delusions, power leaked into dangerous hands. His wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, began making decisions in his name. But hers was not the steady hand of a savior. She had her own ambitions. And while Charles drifted in and out of reality, factions within the kingdom sharpened their daggers, not just against enemies but each other. There were two major powers now, the Armagnacs led by Charles' brother, and the Burgundians led by John the Fearless. These were not rivals. They were warlords. Their feud, fueled by Charles' absence of mind, turned France into a battleground. Cities were burned. Nobles were butchered. The king's palace became a theater of farce, a ruler who forgot his queen, who called himself a peasant who hid in corners when people reached out a hand. And the children, Charles had 12. But in his madness, they were strangers to him. He recoiled from their touch, stared at them blankly. One day, he looked at his wife and asked, "Who is this woman?" This was not a bad husband. This was a man so lost inside his mind that memory itself had been smashed like glass. His court tiptoed between pretending he was lucid and hiding the truth that the king was gone even while he lived. To keep the machine of monarchy running, they created a twisted routine. When Charles had a clear day, they rushed through decisions. When he sank back into madness, they forged signatures, invented decrees. Foreign diplomats found themselves negotiating with a man who insisted he was a blacksmith. And the servants, They became actors in a tragedy with no script, adapting daily to whatever identity their king wore: peasant, priest, porcelain phantom. At night, the palace was quiet but not peaceful. The rustle of robes, the muted sobs of courtiers, and the soft creak of reinforced furniture haunted its halls. Charles would sometimes emerge speaking to invisible figures, blessing phantoms, or warning his guards of a plot that did not exist. The sound of a dropped fork could send him into a frenzy. Silence was safety. Sound could shatter him. Yet, what made this tragedy unbearable was that between episodes, Charles understood. He knew what was happening to him. He apologized, wept, begged forgiveness from those he had hurt in his madness. He spoke of his fear of losing control again, of becoming something monstrous. He laughed nervously at his own glass delusion, but the laughter didn't last. The madness always returned. Meanwhile, France was crumbling. The war with England dragged on. Paris trembled under the boots of rival factions. Taxes soared, food vanished, and faith in the monarchy evaporated. All while the king's soul cracked and reformed like shifting frost. In the shadows of royal fragility, chaos festered and power did what power always does: it moved to fill the void. Queen Isabeau shifted alliances like gowns. One day with the Armagnacs, the next with the Burgundians. She made deals with the English betrayed nobles, even disowned her own son, claiming he was illegitimate. Some saw her as a survivor, others as a traitor. But no one could deny this. In Charles' absence, France was being ruled by ambition, not sanity. In 1407, things reached a breaking point. Louis of Orléans, the king's brother and leader of the Armagnacs, was assassinated. Not in battle, not in exile, but stabbed to death on the streets of Paris. The killer, John the Fearless, leader of the Burgundians. And when questioned, he didn't deny it. It was necessary, he said, and the court did nothing. The message was clear: the crown no longer protected its own. The king could not avenge his brother, could not speak in parliament, could not remember his children. France was rudderless, a ship adrift in blood and smoke. Its monarch sat in Versailles, convinced he was transparent, while the country he ruled tore itself apart for power. In those years, the French court resembled a tragic pantomime. Decisions made by ghosts, nobles swearing oaths to a man who didn't know his own name, ambassadors trying to negotiate with a monarch who called himself Jacques and claimed to be a shoemaker. Protocols bent, forged, mocked. Yet the throne remained sacred. France had a king even if he had forgotten. But as madness deepened, so did the need for salvation. And strangely, salvation came not from within the royal family, but from a teenage farm girl with visions. In the midst of the chaos rose Joan of Arc, a 17-year-old who claimed she was sent by God to restore the French crown. She was fearless, determined, and the kingdom, desperate for hope, listened. Joan's rise was meteoric. She inspired soldiers, rallied the broken, and brought a sense of divine destiny to a fractured land. But her success was as much a condemnation of Charles VI as it was a miracle. For her to lead, the king had to disappear, and he had. While she fought to crown his son, the old monarch remained locked in his private glass prison. And yet Charles VI lived. Through all the war, betrayal, madness, and death, he lived. For over 40 years, he sat on the throne more symbol than sovereign. His name was invoked in laws he never read, in treaties he couldn't comprehend. When he died in 1422, it wasn't a shock, it was a formality. France had already learned to function without him. He had become quite literally invisible. The funeral of Charles VI was curiously subdued. No grand gestures, no mourning masses that echoed through cathedrals. Most of the nobility had already moved on. The power brokers were elsewhere. The real work of governance had long since passed to his son, Charles VII, and the ever-shifting alliances of war. The king's death, like his madness, passed in silence. But his legacy was anything but quiet. France was in ruins. The treasury was empty, the nobility fractured beyond repair, and English troops controlled Paris. The once proud monarchy had become a ghost ship drifting in blood-stained waters. What Charles left behind wasn't a kingdom. It was the outline of one cracked, fragile, and transparent like the man himself. Historians would later call him Charles the Mad, but that title conceals more than it reveals. Madness was not a mask he wore. It was the weather inside him, unpredictable, uncontrollable. He was not a villain. He was not a tyrant. He was a man haunted by the betrayal of his mind and condemned by a crown that could not allow for imperfection. What's most chilling is that Charles knew. In rare, lucid moments he would apologize, weep, even laugh bitterly at his own delusions. But there was no cure, no salvation. His lucid self was trapped inside a body ruled by fear. His intellect, still sharp, was caged in a mind that would not obey. Few rulers in history have suffered so deeply from what they could not control. Modern psychiatrists believe Charles may have suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, triggered by the immense stress of rule, genetic predisposition, and possibly even poisoning. But in his time, there were no words for what he endured, only superstition. He was called cursed, touched by demons, punished by God. None of these labels helped him. All of them doomed him. There's a cruel poetry in the glass delusion. A king so powerful he could command armies, yet so afraid he refused a handshake. A monarch wrapped in velvet and iron, terrified that one wrong step would shatter him. Charles VI didn't just believe he was fragile. He governed like he was. And the nation mirrored its king, splintered, brittle, and endlessly on the verge of collapse. The court around him became a mirror hall of pretense. Every gesture exaggerated for safety. Every voice softened in fear. Servants treated him like a relic, not a man. Ministers used his name but ignored his will. France became a theater of politeness, masking panic. And every day the question loomed, would the king wake up tomorrow as a man or a memory? For the French people, Charles's madness was a mystery wrapped in rumor. Some feared him. Others pitied him. Many simply endured him. The common folk didn't know their monarch. They knew the results higher. Taxes more, war no bread. To them, the Glass King was not a man but a symbol of everything broken, unreachable, and cold. And yet Charles VI changed history, not by decree, not by triumph, but by collapse. His absence created space for chaos. His fragility opened a door for Joan of Arc's fire. His failure forced France to rethink what a king could be and what power truly costs. He was not remembered for what he did, but for what happened because he could not. Centuries later, artists and philosophers still write about the Glass King. He appears in plays, essays, paintings, sometimes as a cautionary tale, sometimes as a tragic figure. To some, he is absurd, to others, deeply human. Because in the end, Charles VI is a reminder of something no crown can protect you from: the human mind's ability to destroy itself. In the medieval imagination, madness was divine punishment or demonic possession. But Charles's illness defied those categories. He wasn't raving endlessly or howling at the moon. He moved through palaces with careful, precise steps, terrified, not monstrous. That made it worse. He looked normal, regal, even until he wasn't. Until his mind shattered in front of you. One ambassador from Italy wrote home describing Charles as a man trapped in a looking glass. He sees himself, but dares not breathe. Others refused to meet him, calling his court a theater of sighs and mirrors. Diplomacy became a guessing game. Who was really in charge today? The Queen, the Duke, or the ghost in the padded robe? Charles' attendants developed coping rituals. Some hummed quietly to soothe him. Others carried soft bells to alert him from a distance, never too suddenly. One pageboy reportedly whispered prayers every time he approached with food, not for himself, but for the king, because a startled Charles could turn violent or disappear into silence for days. Sometimes he was gentle. He'd cradle objects as if they were sacred. He spoke to his dog like a priest might address the Virgin Mary. Other times he would destroy everything within reach, screaming that shadows were alive and mirrors were watching him. The court lived in constant whiplash between tenderness and terror. His youngest daughter, Catherine, once tried to hug him. He backed away in horror, clutching his arms, whispering, "Don't let me break." She never tried again. That small moment echoed in her own life when she was sent to marry the Mad King Henry V of England. It was said she recognized something in his eyes, a shadow she had seen before. Not even religion helped. Priests tried exorcisms. Pilgrimages were arranged. Sacred relics were placed beneath his pillow. But nothing worked. In one tragic episode, Charles claimed he had become invisible, not metaphorically, but physically. He stood in the middle of court, naked, from the waist up, weeping, because no one could see the soul inside the glass. His doctors tried everything: leeches, herbs, bloodletting, even music therapy. One monk tried to treat him with the sound of chanting bells. For a week, Charles slept surrounded by monks in shifts, the abbey echoing with whispered hymns. It worked for 3 days. Then he awoke, screaming that the bells were cracking his bones. Through all of this, France continued to bleed. The English took more territory. The Burgundians grew stronger. The people grew poorer. The idea of king became abstract, something on coins, not something on a throne. And Charles, he became a rumor, a story you told your children at night. Be careful. Don't frighten the King of Glass. There were times when Charles returned just enough to remind people of what they had lost. In 1413, he attended a ceremony and gave a short speech. It was coherent, touching, even inspiring. For a moment, the court believed he was healed. But that night, he screamed at his reflection for hours. He said the man in the mirror was mocking him. The worst cruelty of all was memory. Charles remembered being sane. He remembered the victories, the reforms, the love he once had. And then, inevitably, the fog would return. He would vanish again, leaving only his body behind. It was not madness alone that broke him. It was the unbearable clarity in between the windows of sanity that made his imprisonment all the more painful. When his lucidity returned, Charles often asked about things that had already collapsed. "Is my brother still at court?" he once inquired years after Louis's murder. The attendants lied, gently saying he was away on campaign. Charles nodded. He smiled. He believed them. Because the truth would have crushed him, and perhaps even he knew deep down that the glass could no longer take another crack. There's a strange beauty in how the royal household adapted. Painters started depicting Charles not in battle, not in judgment halls, but in repose, sitting alone, draped in shadow, eyes distant. They captured not his authority, but his fragility. For the first time in history, the image of a king was not about power, but about survival. The glass delusion wasn't unique to Charles. In fact, it was strangely common among nobles in medieval and Renaissance Europe. Scholars, wives, dukes, many believed themselves made of glass. But no case was more vivid, more documented, or more destructive than the King of France. His belief didn't just affect his body, it infected an entire nation. Every creaking step he took changed court life. Every sigh was listened to like prophecy, every touch was questioned. Guards were retrained not for swordplay, but for silence. Pages were chosen not for strength, but softness. And across the realm, rumors spread like fire. The king is cracked, the crown is cursed, and France is held together by trembling hands. Charles's madness became a metaphor. People lived inside. Poets wrote of hearts like glass of thrones, too fragile to bear the weight of justice. Clerics preached that sin had turned the king transparent, and children learned to speak of him in hushed tones, as though words themselves might reach his ears and push him further into the abyss. Even war took on a strange shape. Battles were fought in the name of a monarch who didn't know they were happening. His standard was raised by men who hadn't seen his face in years. England invaded not against a king, but against a vacuum. And yet Charles's broken crown still inspired loyalty, perhaps, because it was the only thing left that hadn't yet fallen. Inside the palace, some whispered that perhaps it would be better if the king didn't recover. At least now, decisions could be made. At least now, the factions had room to maneuver. A healthy king would ask questions, would demand answers, but a mad one. He simply listened to voices no one else could hear. He was terrifyingly convenient, and yet he endured. Through assassinations, through sieges, through betrayals, Charles lived. His body, despite the fear, did not shatter, but his soul. It had been fractured long ago, and each episode pressed the shards deeper. A man whose every breath was a miracle, whose every step was a negotiation with dread. That he lived so long was in itself a kind of curse. In his final years, Charles's moments of lucidity became rarer. He spoke less, moved slower, looked through people more often than at them. But there was one strange, haunting detail: he smiled more. Not the smile of joy, but the peaceful, empty smile of someone who had surrendered. He no longer feared the cracks. He had become them. When he died in 1422, there were no grand revelations, no final speech to crown his legacy. He slipped away like a whisper behind a curtain. The world barely paused. No revolts, no mourning mobs, because France had already lived without him for years. Charles VI, once the beloved, then the mad, was buried in stone. But in the minds of his people he had already turned to glass. His burial site was modest by royal standards. No towering mausoleum, no eternal flame, just a tomb among many in a kingdom now ruled by others. The marble bore his name, but not his story. Not the nights he cried in corners. Not the silences that swallowed entire councils. Not the 1,000 invisible shards he carried inside his skin. And yet his reign would not be forgotten. Historians would pore over his life not for battles won, but for minds lost. His condition became a case study for generations. Medieval scholars called him cursed. Enlightenment philosophers called him proof of monarchy's fragility. Modern psychiatrists saw in him the earliest royal documentation of chronic mental illness. He forced France to ask hard questions. Can a crown protect a cracked mind? Should one man hold so much power when one delusion can doom a nation? Charles didn't just leave behind a kingdom. He left a mirror, and in it every monarch since has seen the same reflection: power without clarity is danger, rule without stability is tragedy. And still his story lingers in the shadows of history books. Not shouted but whispered, not taught but hinted at. Because it is uncomfortable. Because it makes rulers look small and madness feel close. Charles VI reminds us that even kings, especially kings, are not immune to the slow undoing of the mind. In his own strange way, Charles changed governance. His absence forced a shift. Power spread, councils grew stronger, regencies became more formalized. The idea of divine right was no longer enough. A kingdom needed continuity even when its ruler disappeared into fog. From that vacuum, modern statecraft began to emerge. And what of those who served him? The pages, the scribes, the guards who tiptoed through glass dreams, most vanished from record. But in scattered letters one finds fragments: a servant's confession of fear, a bishop's note about the tender mercy in the king's eyes, a nursemaid's quiet pride that she had once brushed his hair during a lucid day. Tiny stories. Human ones. The Glass King became legend. In plays, he was both fool and prophet. In poems, he was light-breaking into fragments. Artists painted him surrounded by mirrors, his face a blur. In one famous engraving, he sits on a throne of crystal crown slipping from his head, staring at his own reflection with childlike wonder and horror. He was not the first mad monarch. He would not be the last. But none embodied fragility like Charles. He didn't lash out in tyranny. He withdrew. He trembled. He whispered. And in doing so, he showed the world a different kind of collapse, not through blood, but through fracture. Not in public execution, but private implosion, and perhaps that is what makes his story resonate today. In an age that still struggles to understand mental illness, Charles VI stands as a symbol not of weakness, but of the unbearable weight of expectation. A man asked to be steel who discovered he was glass. A boy groomed for glory whose greatest enemy was within. The kingdom cracked around him. The war raged on. But the most haunting image is not of fire or steel. It is of a man flinching from an outstretched hand. A man who once ruled millions, now begging not to be touched. In that single moment, all of France trembled not from war, not from politics, but from the soundless, invisible shattering of a human soul. In the archives of France, where wax loses its shine and parchment tastes of dust, Charles endures as a margin, note a smudge beside grander names, yet that smudge reshapes the page. Scribes strike amend overwrite, but always some faint impression remains a king who walked carefully as if the world were shards, and a government forced to learn how to function when the sun on the coin could not remember it was the sun at all. From that forced improvisation came a rough blueprint for continuity councils. Strengthened regencies formalized, and legitimacy tethered less to a single pulse and more to a web of oaths. Monarchy did not soften, but it learned grudgingly that even crowns must be engineered against failure, that the mind at the top is a load-bearing beam, and that a nation needs scaffolding for the days the beam buckles. Close your eyes, and you can still hear the palace trying not to be heard. The padded thrones, the gloved attendants, the doors eased open on breaths rather than hinges. A bell tolls somewhere in the chapel, and the sound seems dangerous, as if vibration itself might spider across the king's skin and splinter him, so the court holds its breath, an entire political ecosystem built around the management of a single man's heartbeat. When power falters, stories rush in to replace it. Treaties sworn in other rooms, oaths made on other banners. Sons declared heirs, heirs declared bastards. And yet in one late lucid flicker, the fading monarch does what the state could not. He names a future out loud. It is not law that moves anyone in that moment, but a tired human voice trying to push order through the crack of its own unraveling. Glass is born of violence, sand hammered by fire, until it becomes clarity, then cooled into brittleness. So too with rule victory anneals into peace until the heat returns and the surface crazes. Charles taught Europe an ugly formula. No scholar wanted to admit it. Transparency without resilience is just another way to break. Look past the crown, and you find the lesson that keeps rewriting itself across centuries. Minds fail in palaces as easily as in cottages. Titles do not insulate neurons. And if a kingdom cannot make room for the reality that a ruler is a patient on some days, it will make a patient of the kingdom instead. Picture the throne room at dusk, dust drifting like slow snow in a shaft of light tapestries, breathing with the draft a chair too carefully cushioned for a warrior. A servant steps in with soft shoes, lays a document where a hand used to sign and withdraws. The quiet is not peace. It is choreography, the delicate ballet required to keep a nation from ringing like a struck goblet. This is why his story outlives the dates, because we recognize ourselves in the metaphor a workplace, a family, a country built around someone's invisible fracture. We call it different names. Now, stress burnout illness, but the physics have not changed. Too much pressure on a fragile surface and the crack will run until it finds the edge. So, the question that hums beneath the chronicles is not, how could a king think he was glass? But which of our institutions are we pretending are steel when we know they are not? Which rituals do we pad with velvet because we fear the slightest jolt? And what would it take to build a politics that assumes breakage and designs for repair if the image that stays with you is a man flinching from an offered hand? Let it also be the image that reframes power leadership as the courage to be touched, governance as the craft of shock-proofing the common good. And if you want more of history's strangest fault lines where private delusions bend public fate like the video, drop a comment with the next tale you want unmasked and subscribe so you don't miss what we uncover when the past light glass catches the light and shows every hidden fracture.